Welcome. We're going to try to keep it nice and sweet. It's the last panel of the day. I want to thank my panelists for being here. I'll start with a quick round of introduction. My name is Gabriele Columbro. I am the Executive Director of FINOS, the FinTech Open Source Foundation, which is the financial services-focused open source foundation under the Linux Foundation. I actually also have a second hat, which is the General Manager for Linux Foundation Europe. We just announced last September the creation of an entity in Europe, in Brussels. Fi, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, great. So I'm Ffion Acland. I am a Vice President at Goldman Sachs. So I currently co-lead our global data modeling and governance team. That's my internal hat there. And then externally, I do a lot with all of our trade associations, including with the Common Domain Model, which we'll talk a lot about, and really thinking about how do we build data models in the industry for the industry, which is more what we'll talk about as we go through.
Rudy, you want to go next?
Thank you. Yes, indeed. My name is Ruddy Vincent. I'm a senior advisor at ISDA. So this is the International Swap Derivative Association. So it's a trade association that looks after some of our large banks around the world. And in my role, I particularly assist with some of our initiatives about data modeling and how indeed financial institutions are making use of that in a standardized way to make it safe and efficient.
Georgina.
I'm Georgina Jarratt. You'll be glad to hear the A on each of the acronyms means the same thing, so there's a bit of data consistency right there. We're all associations.
Yeah.
And we're not for profit, actually, so we sit in financial services, but we exist for the stability, security, and safe and effective and efficient operation of the different industries that we represent. ICMA is the International Capital Markets Association, not to be confused with the broader term capital markets, which is all products. We look up after the debt capital markets world. Bonds, government bonds, corporate bonds, that kind of thing, repo, collateral, etc. That's me, and I'm the head of FinTech digitalization, so we work on a lot of the models side of things, and we've been part of the project that we're going to talk about.
Chris.
Last but not least, the International Securities Lending Association, ISLA, there you go. I work primarily on the digital side. Essentially, my main role is doing development of the Common Domain Model. So I've been working with Gab now towards getting the model into the CDM. It's been an exciting time for us all, I think, to be honest. And I think I've got the longest title as well, which is Senior Associate of Market Infrastructure and Technology. It didn't fit on the end. There we go.
And you actually had to read it out of there so to remember it. But, and for the audience, we will quiz you on what those acronyms mean by the end of the session. So just pay attention. So thanks for being here. We're in an open source, open conference. It's not quite common to see financial services participating to an open collaborative process. So, FINOS is just to set the stage, is one of the few vertically focused foundations within the Linux Foundation and more broadly in the ecosystem out there. We're focused specifically on financial services rather than necessarily on a particular piece of technology, but certainly collaboration on data and data models has been one of the, since the very beginning, one of our, cornerstones, especially since Goldman Sachs also open sourced a framework called Legend, which is hosted now in FINOS. We think open source goes beyond code and really is about delivering business value. And so Fi, as a representative, of one of the sort of largest investment banks in the world, can you talk about why open standardization and, open source is so important to financial services?
Absolutely. So I think when you think about open source, at least in my mind, having grown up through the financial industry, you think of it as a very techie side of things. Actually, a lot of the tech, we were talking about it before, a lot of the tech organizations as part of the bigger banks are some of the biggest parts of the organization. And I think that's just telling about the amount of data now that has to come through, along with other things. And the reason it's so important is it's less about the volume of data, which I think is perhaps the issue or the complexity in other industries. In the financial industry, it's actually the complexity of the structure, like the data structures. And because what we're trying to do is model and represent contracts between multiple parties, in some cases, of really complex products. So imagine people in the room, if you are familiar with perhaps what a bond is, that's perhaps on the more simpler side of the financial industry. And we go all the way to the other end where we have really complex structured derivatives that can represent and have a lot of these things as the underlies. And we've somehow got to store all of that data, but also then share it across the industry. And I think it's the sharing it bit that really we start thinking about when we're talking about standards. Because you can imagine you only have to look sort of across, I'm sure you have this when you're working sort of globally, you say one word to a colleague in another country and they're thinking something else. And you can cross wires forever until you realize that what you actually said is not what they heard. And we have that all the time within the financial industry. We're talking about one thing and the other person's heard something else. And so really what we're looking at when we're talking about open standards here and using it in the financial industry is just making sure we're talking the same language when we start, so that when we're sharing the data for what we really mean, as opposed to what we think the other person's heard. So hopefully that makes sense as to why we need it in the financial industry, and it's really grown in that space.
That's a really good. I also understood, and I don't come from financial services.
You were supposed to already understand.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I guess. On that note, and let's see how much I understood in the last 5 years. What we're going to talk about today is a really interesting initiative that is going to happen, that is happening in FINOS, a project that we're working together around the common domain model. The common domain model is actually a model to represent financial instruments across the 3 different associations that we're going to talk about. And, we have worked a lot on the open source side of modeling data, and more recently, the 3 associations decided to actually take a leap from open standards to open source. Not only so, but they decided to join forces and collaborate on their data model to create a unified data model, and then open sourcing it in FINOS. So let me go to the associations, and again, you got to remember the acronyms. This is an industry that is, it's pretty familiar with standards, FIX, SWIFT. Some of you might have heard about those standards, but it's certainly not very well renowned to be an open source participant. So this is a 2-part question for each one of you. Can you share with the audience, why each association has decided to, firstly, collaborate with each other, and then secondly, to actually move to the open source model of development under FINOS? Georgina, you want to start?
Sure. Well, we shouldn't take the badge here because we joined our friends in ISDA and ISLA last. So I don't know, is that last mover advantage, or if we let them do the hard work and then we turn up and add our bit on the end? So I think in simple terms, we have a massive membership, and we worked out before we came in here that between the 3 trade associations we represent about 2,000 financial services participants, let's call it, not just banks, asset managers, issuers, all sorts of people who play in that industry front to back. And actually, we go to our members often to say, what would you like us to work on? We're very tiny teams, but we're there to do good things for them. So actually, from our perspective, this was something that was voted for by the members to say, look, it would be really useful if we could represent these transactions that should be very simple. You're right, I'm happy to be the simple one on the stage, by the way. It's also spectacularly important in how we fund our countries and, how the government hopefully doesn't, do the wrong thing, as we've seen quite recently in this country. But how we model those transactions in one way, there is no reason for us to model them in different ways. It's just happened that way because the industries have grown up like cress or grass seed or whatever in their own ways, individually and independently, because there was nothing to work from that was kind of like, this is how we should model this transaction. So if we were starting again, and we're a bit far down the road for that, we would definitely design the fundamental flows of those transactions in a singular way that all, in our case, 620 organisations followed and understood and spoke the same language, to Fi's point. And we are global, we're all global actually, so across all those countries, across governments, etc. So that's why. Joining together, why would we build something that Fi has to talk to 3 of us about? That would be a bit silly. So I think, representing our one of our many 2,000 consumers, they don't want the trade associations to be doing their own thing. That's not helpful. We represent different products, but we're all in financial services. So, again, I think it's unusual that we collaborate this closely. So
Yeah.
it's a good thing.
Chris, Rudy, you want to go next, Chris?
A lot of the banks are members of all the associations.
Yeah.
So they're not just members of ISLA, for example, they are members of all three. So it behooves us basically to actually do this together. And I think, banks are not famous for wanting to spend money. So if we can do it together, we can help them save some money too. So beneficial from that perspective too.
And
Makes a lot of sense.
I have the privilege to have been part of the common domain model initiative from the start. And one of the fundamental principles was to establish this common language across the boards to lower the barriers and ensure that the same data can serve multiple business services, multiple functions, and the ability to describe with the same language how to exchange things, how to pay for things together, really paved the way for better efficiency, paved the way for better data quality.
Yep.
And what we realized from the start is that if we have an opportunity, it's about the data, because it underpins so many systems, so many processes, so many functions in the financial sector. So we realized, let's make it happen. And we've been at it for about 5 years now. So we have had a chance to really build something that is arguably robust enough to become useful. And this is where the open source framework really is extremely helpful, because to define the standards, we need adoptions. We need to bring it out there. You need to come out of the garage where we were tinkering with all those tools, and we're like, look, now let others use it. Let others give us the feedback on what works, what doesn't, and really together collaborate, leverage the extremely powerful power of a community like the open source framework, and bring vendors and implementers together as here's a tool that the financial industry has recognized as this bring us together. Therefore, others can leverage it to build solutions. And that's really one of the reasons why open source is particularly helpful. And this is also why we thought, let's collaborate together as a common approach across with FINOS.
And you mentioned standards as well, like FIX and SWIFT.
Yep.
It's a great point Rudy just made as well. About 6 years ago, the ISO 20022 standard came out for SFTR, which is a massive reporting regime, basically. I use regime rather than regulation because it is very restrictive. And they requested so much data, and they wanted it in a particular format, which actually was a really good idea. And I think at that point, the industry then sort of thought, hang on a minute, we're going to have to provide this information. It's got to be in a standard format. We should have been doing this for 10 years. But we hit it too late. So every vendor went out, and the banks as well, developed their own platforms, their own individual applications to go and service the requirement from the regulators. If that actual standard, if we'd realised we needed a standard beforehand, then the regulators wouldn't have needed to enforce this new standard because we would have had it already.
Yep.
This is where open source comes into play, because if we'd actually had the community involved, it would have been developed, there would have been no pain at all. Regulator wants this data, done. Right. Got no click today.
Nervous.
It's okay. Better now.
That's fascinating, and I mean, it's good for customers. If I can paraphrase, it's good for regulators, and I think this is actually, we're super excited to support you in this journey as a foundation that is very much focused on the industry. And we also see the potential. I think that's sort of the other level of alignment with FINOS. We see major potential for regulators to also be, gaining by the inherent transparency that open source provide to the process. So we talk about vendors. We talk about regulators. We talk about customers. Let's talk about a potentially more controversial topic. Let's spice it up a little bit. This is an industry, financial services, that historically has been, from someone that is coming from open source, from other industries, been historically, quite locked in, by vendors, and sometimes using, and even basing their business models on proprietary data formats, let alone proprietary code, of course. So why would, vendors buy into this idea, not only of an open standard, but actually of, open source? I mean, Fi, I'll start with you as the consumer here.
Yeah, I'm going to probably come at it from a slightly different angle. I think for us, when we're actually engaging with our vendors, we want to avoid situations where there's potentially monopolies developing.
Yep.
So by having open standards, something that is open source, it means that from a format perspective at least, or the language side that we're talking about, we're all speaking the same language. It's equally not necessarily the proprietary part of a vendor's offering, or at least it shouldn't be. The way we describe a product, the details that need to be exchanged for a confirmation of a contract or whatever we're talking about, the actual data format isn't really proprietary. How they use it and what the data is, absolutely. But from a format perspective, it shouldn't be. And so I actually think for many vendors, using something that's already been built for them actually saves them a lot of time. But actually from sort of our perspective, it reduces that barrier to entry, and so it allows and avoids that sort of monopoly perhaps building. I think the other side for me, just a little bit on from that, is actually allowing, by open source, it actually allows them into the conversation. So sort of a lot of the historic part of the financial services has been about who's at the table, and sort of the people at the table are getting the say, and that perhaps hasn't been the entire industry either. And so by having it in an open source space, we're actually getting a lot more players to the table, and also not just financial services people coming in, right? Even through FINOS, it's not just financial services people that are at the table, and actually as a financial services industry, we can learn from other industries and actually get that input. So a slightly different answer to it. But for me, it's definitely about the lowered barriers of entry and not competing on something that's not necessarily proprietary, if that makes sense.
I think that's spot on. Rudy?
And that very much speaks, again, to one of the key objectives of this initiative, the common domain model, is to recognize that there is no point with two different banks trying to represent in two different ways the same transaction, the same agreement. It doesn't make sense. And when you speak with implementers and vendors, well, if the market participants agree on here's one way that we expect to represent the agreement, and you present it to an implementer who will say, look, I want to build a matching tool, I want to build a solution that speaks to the banks, well, here's a tool that really accelerates your implementation, accelerate your journey for providing that service, because the banks are effectively expressing, here's how I expect to represent that agreement. Therefore, you can pick that and run with it, because then you can focus on your business offering. So there is really an opportunity by bringing the common domain model in an open source setup to lower indeed the barriers for implementation, to bring that neutral ground across the community, so that the big firms as well as the small implementers together, they can benefit from it immediately. They can provide immediate feedback on what works, what doesn't work. Therefore, the expectation is that it accelerates the journey for real efficient solutions.
Value added, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think to answer your question a little bit, Gab, about why the industry grew up the way it did, and we've talked a little bit about the fact that I was at HSBC before ICMA, which I joined quite recently, for a long time, and actually these institutions, by the nature of being independent from one another, have had to build their own technology solutions, etc. They have deep legacy stacks that are extremely difficult, speaking from very personal experience, to even slightly unpick. So trying to re-engineer that kind of world to make everybody speak the same language and use the same models is an interesting debate. And I think one of the things we've all been talking about is The next step is adoption. We've built it, we give it to FINOS, we go, ta-da, everybody, here it is, you can all use it, which, as you say, if you're a small vendor and you're starting out, great, pick it up, use it, brilliant, you don't have to start again, and we start to get some standardisation. I think the reason that that has happened historically is that for some reason in financial services, you know, everything was built individually by them, by their own technology departments. A lot of we didn't buy technology in the old days. We were scared of the cloud, you know.
Yeah.
We were like, wow, that's really dangerous. And if I do
You
that,
were?
it's all going to go wrong. So do you honestly think that HSBC's data centres are safer than the biggest technology vendors in the world? So that's been a real emotional shift for those institutions. And now we're seeing some of the fintechs, some of the smaller organisations coming in, and we're more open. The financial service industry is more open to going, okay, let's have a look at what you guys have got. If it's a model that we've contributed to as financial services participants, and we know it's quite good and it's pretty accurate, and we've done it together and it's taken 5 years and we've all gone grayer in the process. I'm not talking about you. Talking about me, even though I wasn't there. But, you know, if you have all gone grayer in the process, then you trust the model because you've been part of the journey. So, you already know you've built something together, and therefore it's got to be pretty good because it's had a lot of eyes on it.
Yeah.
But I think that's a massive culture shift that's happened in the last, I don't know, I guess if you were in the technology department, you'd say longer. But for me, on the business side of things, I would have said, 5 years or so?
I would say 5
Maybe
years.
5 to 10 maximum.
Yeah.
So, yeah. New world.
I'm going to have to apologise because, Georgina, unfortunately...
Did I steal your answer again?
No. I am, unfortunately, a vendor. Well, I was working for a vendor for 25 years, so the product...
Don't apologise.
I have to apologise. I'm sure our product
He's gonna
was one of
correct
those
me.
products that gave you the headache.
Probably.
But basically, 25 years ago, there were not many products on the market, especially from a securities lending perspective. And we did try to tie you in with data.
Yep.
Our product was actually very good at inputs and outputs. Basically, we had profile-based, we could manage the data, fantastic. You chuck anything at us, we could manage it, we could take it in. We didn't care, it was in a million different formats because we could do that, and we tied you into our product. Now, as Georgina has said, if you're trying to get rid of those products, you move into the cloud, for example. You can't. It's impossible. We had a client, well, from my old company, I had a client who wanted to upgrade a version. They didn't do it because it was going to cost them in excess of £1 million to do. So they thought, well, okay, we'll just stay where we are. Great decision. Not. So essentially, moving to a common standard means we're going to move away from the legacy systems. It gives you the opportunity to actually do something that everybody else can actually use together rather than you're stuck with this one application. From a vendor's perspective, you may think, oh, crikey, why do we want to do that? We want to tie you in still.
Yep.
When I was a developer, I used to spend about 80% of my time basically doing business as usual. I would spend about 20% of my time doing innovation. As the market moved, we lost traction because the other companies were coming in, these small disruptors, the unicorns, they were coming in and going, right, we could do that. They're still in the past. We can do that now. We'll do that now. We can do it better. We can communicate with all the other systems just as well. You're stuck in the past. So what we should have been doing was switching that around so it was 80% innovation, 20% spent on the data, etc., the business as usual.
Yep.
If the standards were there and we could communicate with all the other systems without having to actually spend 80% of this time wasted,
Yep.
then we would have been miles ahead.
Yeah.
We didn't. So basically the standardization should improve vendors to actually come up with more products,
Yep.
accelerate that, because someone already in the open source realm will probably have done 90% of what you want already.
Yep.
You use that open source, job done.
It's fascinating. I mean, I'm personally quite proud to hear you guys talking about avoiding monopolies, innovation, the business value of open source, better interaction with regulators. It's interesting how, coming from the open standard world versus the open source world, we're ultimately motivated by sort of the same goals. And that's why I think this is a match made in heaven here. But look, we're drawing to a close. So I want to do a quick lightning round with 3 associations. We're one of the most clearly conservative and regulated industries in the world. Our community, our FINOS community is based, half here in the city and half in Wall Street. And I've been always, I think the way FINOS was able to crack such an industry was really to start from the why, starting from the business value, as you touched upon, Georgina, of open source. It's hard to sell open source in regulated industries for open source sake. So 30 seconds. Can you share with us a quick statement? It was going to be 1 minute statement, so now 15 seconds, the more I keep talking. What's been the hardest thing in convincing your boss in the process of open sourcing the CDM? Chris.
It was actually very easy for me because I changed job to basically help open source the CDM. So
great.
I had absolutely no problems persuading my boss. He employed me specifically for the task. So
easy answer.
Sorry,
I let you off easy on that one.
I'm quicker. I didn't do it, so
Great, perfect.
picked it up. Job
Almost
done.
like as we hadn't prepared.
Didn't do it.
Well,
I think, Rudy, you are the most.
He needs more seconds.
I think I'll say that this, for us, is a little bit of unknown territory.
Yes.
We're coming from a very traditional ecosystems where things are done by the book, so to speak. There is this element of innovations, there's an element of fast pace.
Yep.
And that's the part that where we are learning. We are setting new precedents, and we need to really learn quickly.
Yep.
And for me, and one of the open question is, okay, are we gonna make it? And we believe so, because we've tested it internally. Now, let's get it out of the garage, give it to the world, let's work together.
Thank you, guys. We're here to help, and
You better learn what it is, though, before we see you next time.
man, I gotta do my homework. But seriously, we're so honored to be part of this journey with you, and for those of you who want to be involved, this is open source, so there's no price tag attached to it. This is one of the beauties of open source foundations. We have an initiative called Open RegTech that really focuses on mutualizing through open source the cost of regulation, the interaction with regulators, FINOS.org. And with that, I want to thank you, the panelists, and open up for questions, if there's any.
And over here, we've got a microphone.
Okay, I have some questions. All right. So,
Can we let this?
Hi there. It sounds like regulation helped bring you together in order to start down this route. If I'm looking at the learnings of this and seeing how we can speed up the adoption in other areas, if you didn't have that regulation, what would have helped bring you together to go down this route?
ooh,
That's a fascinating question.
yeah.
Woody wants to say something.
I was going to say immediately, regulation is certainly what we call a use case, an area of application.
Yep.
But it's one of many. Ultimately, it's cost, efficiency, and safety.
I
And
think it's also our clients, right? It's the 2,000 firms that we represent. I mentioned, when they say to us, guys, we don't want to talk to all three of you. I mean, it's 3 different desks, right? It's 3 different products traded. So there are different people in the bank that deal with the different products. But for a standard model, a transaction model, it's them that is, I guess, saying, you guys really should work together. We don't want you. We don't compete. We don't make revenue, actually, as I mentioned. So whilst we're not charities, it's not far off. We exist only for the good of the industry. So the banks are kind of saying, please, work together. That's bonkers. Why wouldn't you talk to each
I
other?
think eventually there would have been, I don't know what the catalyst would have been, there would have been something that I think that would have essentially moved everyone together. Just like open source. 20 years ago, where was open source?
It's almost a fashion,
you look at it
isn't
now,
it?
and it's like, it's overtaken the world, and it's still going to keep going. I think the same thing would have happened in financial services as well. There was, essentially, when SFTR, when this new standard, the ISO 20022 came out, there was already an understanding that people were going to have to work together more, and I think that was the catalyst, the regulations. So what will be the next catalyst, I don't know.
The regulatory bit is a massive, painful often, but incredibly important for everybody to protect everyone.
Yeah.
Catalyst for change, actually. So if you sit within the banks, every year about 50% of their change budget is spent on responding to regulation.
Yeah.
And normally, where we manage to collaborate with our regulators, that drives change for good as opposed to not for good. So much as they probably complained about that and probably still do, actually it's a huge catalyst for things to change. So yeah, it's still a very important part of that. I'm not sure it was only regulation that would bring us together though, but it's a big part of it.
Yeah, I'd have thought, Rudy, when we started off, what was it, back in 2016, right, we kicked off the common domain model. I think that catalyst was more about the post-trade processing side of contracts in the derivatives industry. So we were talking really about, I've got this contract between two people. If I'm talking about perhaps an interest rate swap, it can be 25, 40 years long, and lots can happen on that one, just on that one contract over 40 years. Yeah. And every time I've got to speak to my counterparty on that over 40 years, we're going to keep clashing. We've got to send money every couple of months. We're going to keep mismatching. And so that's just one contract. And we've got hundreds of thousands of them. I wouldn't like to say how many going around. So I think actually, at least on the derivative side, the catalyst was more from the operational efficiency and effectiveness side of things. By all means, regulation obviously comes into that, and we're getting the benefits across everything. I'd also say in terms of the communication across the three associations, if you think about a derivative, the underlying product of a derivative is something that the ICMA are looking after. It's the primary bond, or it's the prime. So in order for us to even represent a derivative, we need the bond representation to start with. And so we could have, or I say we, ISDA could have gone and done that representation themselves of a bond, but why not get it from the association that actually looks after these things and make sure they're the same? And so I think the joining together of all of them is because these financial products are so interconnected that even to get a derivative, you need the other data points.
What she said.
That's banking for you, nobody understands.
One more question? Yeah?
Sure.
I mean, you are three associations put together, and you do this standardization. So you have also the problem of a big data at this stage. So I would like to know more, what is the role of data engineering? Because I see the data engineering inside this concept of big data and data modeling, because you derive product. So do you have this division on how you operate it?
Oh.
Do we have a data engineering division?
Please.
We absolutely do. I am part of it. Yes, we do have a data engineering department. What do we do within a bank? We are really about looking after the data for the firm. So that's passing data through the firm, but it's also sharing data externally in the best way that we can, making sure that it is modelled, that there's consistency, that the quality is high, and by that we mean we have it well modelled, and that if someone needs that data, they're going to the single source of that data, not the 10 systems that might hold it in 10 different ways. We want to make sure there is an authoritative data store for each piece of data that the firm needs, and everyone who needs that goes to the same place. So that's really what we're doing as a division, is making sure that we are consolidating the firm's data, and then making sure that everyone who wants to access it has easy access to it through data models, through data mappings, so that we can ensure the quality and consistency of data.
And that's a massive change of heart, right? Because for many years, I don't think the banks even understood that their data was important, that they had to look at, that they owned it. They were like, yeah, that's with technology. Yep. Tech and data are together. We don't worry about that. We just trade and do this. And then suddenly, over time, the banks started to realise that, or all the institutions, that actually data is their most important asset. And actually, in many cases, is in a complete mess. So there's so much data, but they can't actually get it together into the data lake and then start to sort it out. You know, put AI onto it and understand their own insights, right? We've gone a long way, I think, to your point, Fee, but also those roles in the business.
I meant to cut you off. I was going to sneak in the open source angle here, which is, of course. Actually, Goldman Sachs is one of the main contributors to the FINOS Foundation, not just from a membership standpoint, but 3 years ago, they contributed a project, as I mentioned, called Legend, which is a very advanced, production-ready data modeling platform, logical data modeling platform, visual modeling platform. which actually, and that's where I think it's really interesting, it's not just about, other firms, of course, can take this platform, use it, install it. We have several other banks that are now sort of using the same technology. But we, as FINOS, we hosted the Legend platform to invite, and FI and the associations played an important role there, to invite data modelers to work in an open source manner. Actually, this platform stores data in GitLab, so ultimately the underlying code is open source code that you can go and raise pull requests or merge requests against. But we invited a whole new population and a whole new set of personas to work through open source governance, through open means. There is not just your typical developer, is the data modeler, is the data engineer, is business folks. I mean, someone that actually can explain to a non-industry participant what the hell are they doing. And so I think that's been a really interesting area for us, I think in reflection to data being the lifeblood.
Insights, right, but we just couldn't get them.
Yep.
Couldn't get them. But yeah, massive topic, I think.
Excellent.
There's a gentleman
Huge
at the back,
topic.
yeah.
Well, I think we need to let people go because we've overrun by 5 minutes, which is more than I've let anyone do in the last 2 days.
We are in Italy. We'll be on
Italian,
time.
that's good.
Yeah.
really
And
good.
you're very special people, so you deserve the extra 5 minutes. The 5 minutes that I give, I give it gladly to you. So
Thank you.
let's thank please stay where you are. Don't move off the stage just yet. But I'd like to thank our final panel, Chris, Georgina, Rudy, Fee, and Gab for a great final panel session in the open data room. So can we put our hands together?
Thank you.